So, you won. New Zealand records first day with no new virus cases. I guess coronavirus has been eradicated? Okay. So then what, right? Well, I guess, they'll make an alliance. So New Zealand and Australia could travel sort of with each other. So Prime Minister Ardern says both our countries' strong record on fighting the virus has placed us in the enviable position of being able to plan the next stage in our economic rebuild. Because they did everything right. So do they just not let anybody in who aren't from these safe countries? How do you determine who's from a safe country? I mean, New Zealand and Australia are right next to each other, right? But there's actually a lot of other countries with no virus, and I think they're correct. Because, if you look, there are all these little islands. Some of these are definitely incorrect. Turkmenistan just pretends it doesn't exist. But North Korea, we don't believe them anyone. But all these other little islands, I think a lot of them are correct. They don't really have virus cases. It's pretty easy to shut themselves out from everybody else and isolate themselves. Plus, the other thing is New Zealand and Australia aren't really dense. Obviously, Australia is not dense at all. They have lots of empty space. It's just easier when you don't live close to anybody else. Let's take a look at the current restrictions around the world. Australia. All foreign nationals are not permitted to enter or transit through Australia. Okay. These countries are permitted to return home. Wow, it just happens to be the places that don't really have any virus. Wonderful, right? Let's look at IATA for their restriction. Japan. Let's see. Okay. All these countries who have transited or been through. Okay, so you have Vietnam, you have USA, UAE. Okay, you don't have Mexico, you have Luxembourg. How do they choose these things, right? It seems it's sort of arbitrary. You have some places like, you know, Vietnam, which doesn't have very many cases at all. And you have US, and they're all sort of treated the same. Did they just sort of take a dartboard and have a list of countries and they just throw darts and see what countries they hit? Huh? I don't know. I mean, is it political? I would think so, right? I mean, the thing is, if you look at the very beginning, right? China had urged open borders. They called it a friendship test. They called on governments not to take measures that imply Beijing can't contain the epidemic. But looking back with a few months sort of hindsight now, we're like, oh, probably a good idea to have a ban, right? Stop the virus from coming in. Is it political? Well, I just came back from Singapore. Supposedly there would be some health screening, right? Entered at LAX, but no, there was no health screening. I had already filled out the form, but no, there was no health screening. Nobody did anything. They didn't, take down my information, ask me if I had any symptoms. I don't even know who to report it to because there was nobody who was really seemed to have that task. But high-risk places like Europe, Schengen, well, not all those places have a lot of cases. Let's say, okay, well, this many cases in the world. Let's say, US has the most cases. Let's say, where is Singapore on this list? Singapore, oh, okay, here, Singapore. Uh, 18,000, almost 19,000 cases. Austria, oh, in Europe, oh, it has actually less cases, right? Is it because they have, more deaths, so it's more serious there? I mean, I think there's obviously a delay in countries being listed in terms of high risk or lower risk, right? Because things change every day. In Singapore, the cases just shot up sort of recently. And then how do you take things, other sort of nuances into account? Singapore has less of a population, so they have more cases per capita, right? I mean, Austria's population is almost 9 million. Singapore has less than 6 million. I mean, going back to, again, remember, political? The US isn't listed as a high-risk country for many countries, and it should be. It has the most cases in the world, has lots of deaths. I think it's pretty risky. I'm pretty sure the status as a rich and powerful country, political pressure, has something to do with that, just the same as with China pressuring other countries. I mean, if you look at places like New Zealand, Australia, let's say you win. You don't have cases now. Then what? You just close your borders to everybody else? Is that a wonderful solution? I mean, there's this concept of you have sort of an equal share in the world, right? You have to take your responsibility. They talk about refugees, right? Like in Europe, you got to take your sort of share of the refugees coming from the Middle East. Is it only fair that if you're doing better, you should take more, like Germany? Because they're richer, right? Compared to the Southern European countries. If you're a country and doing well, do you take sort of the rich people from other countries that are poor? Because rich people have the means to flee. They have the means to pay for themselves to get treatment. And you leave the country with sort of the cases of the poor people. So the country doesn't get overwhelmed by so many cases. My friend in Singapore was talking about how many Indonesians fled to Singapore after they had symptoms. Because they have money, they could pay for their medical care, and they think they're going to get better care in Singapore. Is this allowable? They bring in money to the system. I mean, I'm just talking here. I don't think there's an answer. I don't think anybody has an answer. But this idea of isolating yourself after you're doing well, I guess we don't talk about the idea of good sportsmanship, right? It's like the people who are running a race and they've almost won. Have you ever heard of this race in Alaska where they take a dog sled and they try to make it across with blizzards and all these things? Some people literally die. It's a very dangerous race. It's called a Iditarod. It's commemorating the race of sort of a vaccine where they had to bring it to another place. But the idea is many people there actually try to help other people at the risk of their own life. It's not just at the risk of them winning. It's more important to help people, right? And the question is whether it's acceptable to sit on your laurels and be celebrating, be disease free, right? Coronavirus free, when there's other people still hurting. What is being a good sport? How much does that matter? Or do we not think about that in this world of a coronavirus? I don't know. I just feel that it doesn't seem very right to me. Now, if I were in one of these countries, would I think differently? Maybe so. But I guess it's this idea that we're seeing more and more now. If you're doing better, do you have more of an obligation? If you're one of the haves, do you owe it to the have-nots? To decrease your quality of life, to give yourself a little bit more risk? Or do you just continue on your merry way while everybody else is suffering? I mean, I don't think they view it that way. They're congratulating themselves for putting up with it, for suffering so much, for doing such a good job. New Zealand had it hard, they say. Well, I mean, Italy had a much longer quarantine period, had it much harder. In China, they had it much harder. I'm not really sure what they mean by suffering. So many people did more. right? So many people went through more. But yeah, I don't know what to say. Just some food for thought in this post-coronavirus world, when some countries have recovered and some haven't. Do we all share the burden, or is it going to be more and more unevenly distributed around the world? I guess only time will tell.